Mr. Yunus, I would further propose that we discuss a number of crucial topics that are undoubtedly interconnected. Naturally, for our audience, Ukraine remains the primary focus. However, I believe that we must always strive to rise above the process in order to understand what is happening on a broader scale and to make the right conclusions. For instance, we know that Bob, a longtime senator and Democrat, has now ended up behind bars, 11 years in prison. For what? For corruption, bribery, and lobbying the interests of foreign states. At the same time, we are witnessing ongoing developments in Azerbaijan, specifically the trial of the Karabach separatists. The Nuremberg trial, as it is now being called in Baku, is still underway. Additionally, a widely discussed piece of news is the Russian ambassador being summoned to the Azerbaijani Foreign Ministry due to Russians publishing disinformation, misleading articles, and distorted reports, ultimately deceiving the public. I believe all these events are interconnected. I would like to ask for your assessment of this entire situation. It seems to me that this would be of particular interest to the Ukrainian audience, allowing them to draw the necessary conclusions.
Thank you for such a very good question, dear Yuri. I always appreciate it when journalists prepare seriously for the broadcast, for the interview with their guests, because it shows they are knowledgeable and that you have connected the topics you've mentioned. Look at the different seemingly unrelated topics, one in the USA, another directly in Azerbaijan, and the third related to Russia. But in one way or another, you are right. Everything leads to Ukraine. It would be very good if Ukrainian viewers, the Ukrainian establishment, Ukrainian public figures, politicians, and you journalists who are now working in political analysis and political journalism would closely follow all these processes and understand that the world is not centered around Ukraine. The world is much broader, with so many different perspectives, that sometimes you don't even know where a positive or negative outcome may come from for your country. That's why it is very important to understand what processes are happening in the world. If you manage to move beyond this Ukraine-centered view and assess ongoing processes correctly as part of the geopolitical world, yes, through the lens of the Russian-Ukrainian war, obviously, but still observing what is happening in your immediate neighborhood, and even considering the experience of your closest allies. Azerbaijan is a strategic ally of Ukraine from the first day of Ukraine's independence. For the last 2 decades, we have been in a geopolitical bloc called Guam, which includes Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova. And it is very important to understand why specifically GAM, why this bloc, because we must look at geography and see how many common problems we share with these countries. The main problem is precisely with the Kremlin. And so I will begin with the first part of your broad question related to Bob Menendez. You rightly point out that Bob Menendez is a long-serving senator, nearly 20 years as a senator from New Jersey, who headed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the US Senate for many years. He is one of the most pro-Armenian and controversial senators in the US. And this scoundrel, I can now call him that publicly, and it doesn't sound inappropriate, because the man was sentenced to 11 years in federal court in New York City for receiving a huge amount of money in bribes and finding $500,000 in cash at his home. In court, he cried. Now, preparations are underway for the trial of his wife, who was also involved in this matter. By the way, she is of Armenian descent, and that's why we need to understand why they supported Armenia and where this all originates from. This isn't just about Armenia. His lobbying efforts, I want you to understand, lobbying is legal in America. But if any senator, congressman, or political figure ends up behind bars, it means they have violated even this lobbying law. Yes, to what extent greed can ruin people, even those of such high rank. I have no doubt that he is not the first and won't be the last, because a large number of congressmen, senators, and politicians are involved in these types of violations. As the saying goes, no matter how long the rope is twisted, it will eventually have an end.
и вот этот конец Боба Менендеса, посмотрите, как по-разному воспринимается в Баку и в Ереване.
And now, look at how differently Bob Menendez's downfall is perceived in Baku and Yerevan. In Azerbaijan, there is joy, while in Armenia, there is mourning. The question is, why the mourning? Well, he's a crook. You claim to be honest people. He's a thief, and thieves should be in prison. As Zheglov said in the movie, the meeting place cannot be changed. What am I getting at? To help you understand how corrupt things can be, not just somewhere in the post-Soviet space or in Africa or Southeast Asia, as the collective West often refers to today as the corrupt Western world, including its flagship, the United States. Look at what level this happens at. I won't even talk about the double standards we saw during the presidential campaigns, the battles between the former president and the current president. One was former, the other was acting.
Бывшего президента, нынешнего президента, тогда один был бывший, другой был действующий.
And then we saw, for example, the latest decrees from President Biden, who granted amnesty to his own son, members of his family, and close friends, even for crimes they had not yet committed, thus putting the entire American jurisprudence under suspicion. Yes, all legislation. Who will believe today that good triumphs over evil when you see the president doing whatever he wants, and a senator doing whatever he wants? What about ordinary people? If I had done even 5% of what they have done, these people, or members of Biden's family, or the same Senator Menendez, I would have been sentenced to life imprisonment long ago. Do you understand? Here, small tax violations send people to prison, but high-ranking individuals manage to avoid such consequences. And it's very good that a person of such a high level as Bob Menendez ended up behind bars with such a harsh punishment, yes, 11 years. But what's important to me, and what I would advise you, dear Yuri, and the Ukrainians, based on my personal experience, is this. I've already said many times that I've been in big politics for 35 years, but I was very naive 35 years ago, especially when I worked in the Azerbaijani government and parliament. I held very high positions. At that time, I was completely naive because I believed, I understood that, for example, the Soviet Union was the evil empire, as we were told. It collapsed, and we all rejoiced. But I could never have imagined the double and sometimes triple standards and the level of hypocrisy and falsehood that exists in the Western world. You only understand this when you live here, and I became very convinced of it after the Second Karabakh War, when I saw firsthand how my native Azerbaijan was unjustly treated, actually, truly unjustly. Yes, there can be many claims against my native Azerbaijan, just like against any country on the planet. There are no perfect countries on this planet today. But when we talk about international law, and when in the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I worked in the government when Elchibey was president, they introduced the infamous 907 amendment against us, and people like Menendez were behind it. Well, before him, there was the 907 amendment, when he wasn't yet active. People like him, like Nancy Pelosi and others, who were mostly from the Democratic Party, although there were some Republicans, but mostly Democrats, because the Armenian lobby lives in California. California, as you know, has been a democratic state for decades, and Kamala Harris is from there, as you know. They always supported this issue, and they undoubtedly pushed this agenda. As an example, I'll tell you that the former Azerbaijani ambassador to Washington met with the late Ted Kennedy, brother of John F. Kennedy, who was also a long-serving US senator. When they asked him why he supported Armenia, he was part of the Armenian bloc, supporting Armenia. Why do you support them when justice is on our side? He put a sheet in front of him and said, "Do you see these three sponsors? They lobby for my interests. These three sponsors are of Armenian nationality. They live here. This is Anchor, the Armenian National Congress of America. They are here. Change them to your three sponsors, and then I will support your interests." This is what the famous Senator Ted Kennedy said, and there were many others like him. So money solves everything. And international law, these beautiful words about sovereignty, territorial integrity, and under this banner, freedom of speech, human rights, and so on. And when you see all of this, especially in the last 4 years, I've seen it, and I'm not even talking about what I saw before, in relation to Mikhail Saakashvili in Georgia. This August adventure, the 5-day war in August, and how they sold out Mikhail Saakashvili, who is now in prison. He has been in prison for 3 years. They don't care about his life at all. And how they sold you out in 2014 with the Minsk agreements. And when I see all of this, well, I took off those rose-colored glasses. Today, I think completely differently, sometimes even. Many say, but he lives in the US. Why doesn't he return to Azerbaijan? Why should I? I regularly go to Azerbaijan, you see, but I'm right here. Because if I live here, pay taxes, and I'm a citizen of this country, I truly believe in the ideals for which I gave 35 years of my life, and I stand by them. Why should I leave just because someone here is a crook? Now you see, but I am right here. Because if I live here, pay taxes, and I'm a citizen of this country, I truly believe in these ideals for which I have given 35 years of my life, and I stand by them. Why should I leave just because someone here is a crook? But there are honest people here. Honest people exist everywhere. Because of this, Bob Menendez, because of Biden, because of Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, Barack Obama, should we close our eyes to this or that? We simply need to fight and speak about it. What I am getting at is that you, dear Ukrainians, today, just like many others, are making these naive mistakes. You believed in this so much. Yes, I can understand it due to inexperience. Your previous presidents made many wrong decisions. Let's leave that for history after the war. You will figure it out yourselves. I just want to say as a friend of your country that everything that happened up until now is the result of the Russian aggression's adventure. It is the result of that wrong course. If 50% is on the side of the West, who deceived you, then 50% is your fault. For example, my fault is that I was naive. I accept this responsibility. Maybe I personally didn't do anything wrong, but I was in the government, which means I carry this responsibility, and as a result, I lost my homeland. I lived here in America for over 20 years and couldn't bury my parents. Therefore, I went through this re-evaluation of values, this reformatting, the understanding of how we were deceived. I say this to my fellow Azerbaijanis today, and I do everything to defend my homeland. Yes, I would drive a tank if someone says something wrong, because in foreign policy, truth and justice are on Azerbaijan's side. International law is on Azerbaijan's side. I'm not interested, and I don't engage in internal politics today. Those are the internal affairs of Azerbaijan. We will sort it out ourselves. If I have any questions, I will go to Baku. I'll talk to my people there. I won't discuss this with anyone in the West anymore because they are all hypocrites. You can only talk to them when they openly acknowledge that Karabach is Azerbaijan's territory, when they acknowledge that Azerbaijan followed the UN Charter, that Azerbaijan acted honestly. The truth is on Azerbaijan's side. There will be no lawsuits against Azerbaijan, neither in The Hague, nor in the UN, nor in the European Parliament, because these scoundrels are involved in such things. And how can I trust them in this situation? I, on the contrary, will confront them, defend my position here in the US. This is twice as strong, understand? And this is what I urge you to do. Take off those rose-colored glasses. Know that today, they sold you out. There are healthy forces in the West as well, including in this new collective West. I mean the Baltics, Poland, all those who went through the Russian Empire, those who are closer to your borders. They stand with you, so work with them, but don't trust them. Your mistake is that you included this in your country's constitution. You believed them, that you would be accepted into NATO, and now your president said what I've been telling you for years. You won't be accepted into NATO, and your president said, we were deceived. So, they deceived him, deceived Poroshenko, deceived Yushchenko, deceived all the others. They did deceive them correctly. So draw conclusions. Take off those rose-colored glasses and understand that there are many like Menendez here as well. But again, sooner or later, they will be put behind bars. And the fact that they're behind bars now just proves that not everything is so bad. Processes are underway. And now that Donald Trump has come, I really hope this is a revolution. I really hope this is restructuring. Otherwise, it will be a tragedy for all of humanity. If the US doesn't get out of this political crisis, it could affect the entire world. And here is the second part of your question, which is related to the first part. Because today in Baku, separatists from Karabach, as they called it, the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, are being judged. You see, they ended up in the dock, just like Göring, like Kaltenbrunner, and all the other scoundrels of Nazi Germany, because the hands of the Nazi criminals were stained with the blood of people, and the hands of these scoundrels are stained with blood as well. Not everyone is sitting there today. In my opinion, the first, second, and third presidents of Armenia, Levon Ter-Petrosyan, Robert Kocharyan, Balayan and Serge Sargsyan should also be there. I really hope that sooner or later they will find themselves there too. But in any case, what is happening today in Baku, as you rightly said, is our Nuremberg process for these criminals. And this is also a hope for you. Today you sit and think. You asked me at the beginning of the program about negotiations. What awaits you? And I give you hope in the sense that Azerbaijan has achieved this. We did it, just like you. After the first Karabakh war, I walked with my head down. Inside, I was filled with questions. How? Why? For what? The truth is on our side. Karabakh is our territory. Crimea is your territory. Donbass is your territory. So why is this happening? Why does the world not see it? Why are deals being made behind our backs with the same Kremlin, with Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin? Why are they doing this? And what has led to the realization of our own mistakes and how things work in the West? We have gone through this entire process of reformatting since 1994, after the signing of the Bishkek Protocol, until 2020, when the Second Karabakh War began. I cannot say today when your war, the war that will help you reclaim Crimea and Donbass, will happen, but it is you who must believe in it. If this is your goal, if you set it, if you never accept defeat, and if you prepare for it, just as we prepared for it since 1994, as a state and as a society, then you will have an entire generation ready to fight for what is theirs, just as we did. Our older generation lost the First Karabakh War. Our older generation lost the First Karabakh War. But in the Second Karabakh War, we, the older generation, together with the new generation, reclaimed what was ours. Now at least we have rid ourselves of our shame. We walk with our heads held high. We have fulfilled our duty. And now we are doing everything to ensure that our grandchildren will no longer have to fight. This is exactly what we are doing today. That is why the Nuremberg trial is necessary, to prevent this from happening again. It is necessary for us, for Armenia, for the entire world, so that everyone sees that such a thing must never happen again. We will push through this decisively if needed. And so, we are putting them on trial. Who is against it? People like Menendez, Adam Schiff, and Nancy Pelosi. And imagine, Samantha Power from USAID, a corrupt official just like Menendez. I sincerely hope she will end up in prison. I really hope Donald Trump will ensure she does. Because today she is lobbying for that scoundrel Vardanyan, who is now on trial. In the West, he is called Putin's wallet. He has been listed as a criminal in Ukraine. You have that database there. I think it's called Myrat Vorets or something similar. Vardanyan is there. He is on the sanctions list in Europe, on the sanctions list in the US, yet Samantha Power defends him. Moreover, she is even nominating him for the Nobel Peace Prize, a man who financed the bloodshed in Donbass. Can you imagine? And you, Ukrainians, should be interested in this. Look at who is defending him. The entire Russian liberal opposition has come to his defense. Khodorkovsky, Garry Kasparov, Boris Akunin, Latinina, Shenderovich, all these scoundrels, all these frauds who sold you out, are now defending Vardanyan. Why? Because he has money. I am not even talking about the TV channel Dozhd, led by Ekaterina Katirikadze and her husband. They were funded by him. And now, imagine this trial is taking place. Washington is against it, Paris is against it, Brussels is against it, but we are proceeding with it anyway. They were against us when we started the Second Karabakh War, when we liberated our land, when we conducted counter-terrorism operations. So what? It doesn't matter that they were against us. International law was on our side. The unity of our state and society was on our side. 10 million people, inside Azerbaijan and abroad, stood together as one. Even people like me, who emigrated and were granted political asylum by the Azerbaijani government, stood in the same trench as those who had once forced us out of the country. Do you understand? That was the strength of our society, because some things are bigger than personal ambitions. If there is no homeland, what is there to argue about with the government? What is there to divide? You must understand this. If you have this kind of internal awareness and determination, then you will achieve your goal. And when you do, I have no doubt that in Kyiv, there will be a similar Nuremberg trial. Those so-called Zakharovas, Pushilins, Gherkins, whoever else, whether dead or alive, they will all end up on trial, you can be sure of that. Even if you do not capture them immediately, you will be able to hunt them down in other countries where they will hide, just as they will be hunted down in Russia itself, because the current government in Russia will not last forever. Geopolitical situations always change. Today, even Bashar al-Assad could be betrayed. He could be poisoned just to prevent speculation about him. If the situation changes and it becomes convenient to hand him over, they will hand him over. I say this so that you understand. This is how the world works. This is the second important topic that you also need to understand. How much this process today consolidates Azerbaijani society on a public, political, and ideological level. Not only did we win the war, but we are now conducting this Nuremberg trial. Everyone sees it. In other words, we have restored justice, and we are also punishing the criminals who started this whole tragedy 35 years ago. Some of them are still hiding, like Zori Balayan, who is still alive and living in Moscow. He was one of the key ideologists behind it all. I am honestly glad that he has not died yet. Let him witness this and then perish, because these scoundrels are responsible for what happened. These ideologists exist, and they must be put through a process where they see the consequences of their actions. This must be public. That's why I advise you to pay attention to this issue as well. Now look at this topic, Menendez, this trial, and how deeply it is connected to the ongoing Cold War between us and Russia. Over the past 3 years, I have seen a huge number of biased reports in the Ukrainian media, especially at the beginning, about Azerbaijan, Turkey, and the Azerbaijan-Turkey alliance on various issues. People who don't understand these nuances present their fantasies as facts. Armchair experts, who have no real understanding of what is happening, spread misinformation. But we are doing exactly what you are doing today. We have already done what you are doing now. If it is acceptable for you, why should it not be acceptable for us? And when you ask them this question, they have no real answer. How is Karabach any different from Crimea? Yours is yours, ours is ours. There is international law governing all of this. But here we see double standards at play. When we start to understand this, suddenly we hear claims like, Putin visited Baku, so Azerbaijan is pro-Russian. Azerbaijan, which is not a member of the CSTO, not a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, not a member of the Customs Union, has no Russian troops on its soil, and has signed the Shusha Declaration with NATO's second-largest army. This Azerbaijan is being labeled as pro-Russian. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan's trade turnover with Russia is $4 billion. Now let's look at Armenia. Armenia hosts the 172nd Russian military base in Gyumri, an air base in Erebuni. Its borders with Iran and Turkey are guarded by Russian border troops, and 80% of its economy is controlled by Russian oligarchs and businesses. Not to mention that Armenia's trade turnover with Russia increased by $14 to $15 billion just last year alone. Armenia has no oil, no gas, only gold, diamonds, and ways to bypass sanctions. And yet, some so-called Ukrainian journalists and experts claim that Armenia is moving towards the West, while Azerbaijan is pro-Russian. How can anyone take this nonsense seriously? I am tired of explaining that this is a lie. And when the tragedy with the Azerbaijani aircraft happened, everyone saw firsthand that things are not as they seemed. Once again, dear Ukrainians, I find myself having to explain this to you. I won't even go into the 200-year history of Azerbaijan's relations with Russia and Iran. The Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and Persia fought many wars, and Azerbaijan was caught in the middle of these conflicts. Today, a large part of historical Azerbaijan is in Iran, with Tabriz as its center, while a smaller part, what we now call Azerbaijan, has Baku as its capital and a population of 10 million. Meanwhile, around 35 to 40 million Azerbaijanis live in Iran, making up nearly half of the country's population. People like me who speak Azerbaijani. And do you think we have forgotten our history? Not at all. It has not disappeared anywhere. Now I will talk about the last 35 years. When the Soviet Union began to collapse and the Karabakh issue emerged, including that foolish Myatsan movement that led to separatism, Who supported Armenia? Russia and Iran. Two of your enemies. Two enemies of the US. Two enemies of the collective West. And they supported Armenia. Now imagine when this was happening, on January 20th, 1990. Tanks rolled in during the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the national movement was rising. All of this happened against the backdrop of the separatism that had started in Karabakh. And again, many people claim that the Karabakh events started after the Sumgait and Baku pogroms. No, my dear friends, study history. This is the same kind of propaganda Moscow is feeding you today about 2014. They tell you that Kiev committed genocide against the people of Donbass, that Novorossiya had to be created. The same nonsense we hear from the West, from Moscow, and from every propaganda outlet around the world. Unfortunately, even from some Ukrainian sources. But the truth is, it all started back in 1987. It began in Kafan and Askaran in the fall of 1987. The first several thousand refugees fled from there to Sumgait. Naturally, the KGB exploited this to suppress the national liberation movement. You remember how things were in the Soviet Union. It happened in Tbilisi, in Baku, in Yerevan, in the Baltic states. The country was falling apart, and the KGB wanted to stop it, but they failed. And in the end, what did they do? They sent troops into Baku on January 20th, 1990. General Lebed, perhaps you've heard of this scoundrel, and others like him crushed peaceful civilians under tanks. More than 130 people died. In our Martyrs Alley, you can see who is buried there. Azerbaijanis, Lezgins, Russians, Ukrainians, Jews. Ordinary civilians. There was even a newlywed couple who were caught in the crossfire and died on their wedding day. What's my point? Do you think we forgot this? And just 2 years later, yes, by the way, this was under Gorbachev. Let me emphasize, Gorbachev, the Kremlin, Russia, at that time, the Soviet Union. 2 years later, in February 1992, the Khojaly genocide happened. The Kremlin was still in charge, but now with a different president, Yeltsin. The 366th Motor Rifle Regiment of the Russian Army supported those criminals led by Robert Kocharian and Serge Sargsyan, some of whom are now sitting in the courtroom in Baku. Can you imagine? Do you think that scoundrel ever thought he would end up in a Baku prison 33 years later? We found him, dragged him back, and he couldn't escape. And not just him, there are several others. They will be tried. Now, think about what happened in 1992. Who did this? The same Kremlin. It doesn't matter who was president. This was the Kremlin's doing. After that came the First Karabakh War. Russia did everything, together with Iran, to ensure Armenia's victory over us. Do you really believe the fairy tale that Karabakh's farmers defeated Azerbaijan? That's like saying Donbass coal miners defeated Kiev. Do we believe that? Suddenly, Armenia had everything, tons of weapons. And yet, people claim Russia supported Azerbaijan? If Russia was on Azerbaijan's side, then how did Armenia win? And why did Russian Defense Minister Pavel Grachev, known as Pasha Mercedes, tell Azerbaijan's president in Moscow, "You will cough up blood for expelling Russian troops from Azerbaijan"? We were the first post-Soviet government to expel Russian troops from our territory. And Grachev said to our faces, "You will cough up blood in Karabakh." So, is this what support looks like? Then came the Bishkek Protocol. We had no choice but to sign it. We had no money, no army. The country was divided between pro-Iranian, pro-Russian, pro-Western factions, everything you can imagine. They tried to tear Azerbaijan apart, but we prepared. We learned from our mistakes. We took off the rose-colored glasses. Eventually, a new government took power in Russia, the security services. How they hold power is Russia's problem, not ours. That's their business. Let them deal with their internal affairs and their problems with the West. We have our own country, our own people, our own society. We will decide for ourselves. Some say Azerbaijan is too small to interfere in global matters. The most important thing is that no one interferes in our affairs. And political circumstances made it so that, during the Second Karabakh War, it was not in Russia's interest to interfere against Azerbaijan, especially with the Azerbaijan-Turkey alliance and the growing confrontation between Russia and the West, particularly after 2008. Then came 2020. And now, dear Ukrainians, stop writing nonsense that Azerbaijan liberated Karabakh thanks to Ukraine. Stop claiming that Azerbaijan won the Second Karabakh War because of you. Look at the dates. The 44-day war began on September 27, 2020. Your war started 2 years later. Be objective. Stop spreading misinformation. More than that, Azerbaijan has always supported Ukraine. But in this war, Ukraine has never supported Azerbaijan. Not during the First Karabakh War, not during the Second. Azerbaijan never saw the kind of support from Ukraine that you are receiving from us now. But we don't hold a grudge. You are a sovereign state, and you take care of your own affairs. Just take a closer look at your friends. Learn from our experience. How did we manage to liberate our territory today despite resistance from Washington, Brussels, Paris, and Moscow? Who were our allies? Turkey, Pakistan, Israel. The 10 million people of Azerbaijan, the 200,000-strong Azerbaijani army, which we built over the past 15-20 years according to NATO standards. We worked toward this, we prepared for this. And just as I answered the first question today, you should also prepare. Move towards your goal. Believe in it. I believed in it even while living in the United States. I turned this page. Was I unfairly pushed out of my country? And what then? If necessary, I am ready to emigrate for another 20 years, just to see the sovereignty and territorial integrity of my homeland. Otherwise, what is the meaning of life? Look at the fall of the Russian Empire. The Bolsheviks came, and the white émigrés fled to Istanbul, Paris, and America, shedding crocodile tears. But for what? For the Russian Empire. Why did they treat their country in such a way that it led to the rise of the Bolsheviks? Those Sharakovs and Shvondas. It means we also made mistakes in our time. 100 years ago, when Azerbaijan built its first republic, we surely made some mistakes too. Otherwise, how did the Bolsheviks manage to come to power and overthrow our independent state? We must learn from this. And now, let's talk about the plane tragedy. Suddenly, the world saw that relations between Azerbaijan and Russia were not as smooth as they had been portrayed, especially by pro-Armenian media circles. Why is this happening? I can understand, but when you saw it, you had many questions. Did something serious happen? It's the same Kremlin, a different president. But the interests of the Russian Empire haven't changed. They have always treated their neighbors like this. But Azerbaijan is different now. This is not the Azerbaijan of Mikhail Gorbachev, not the Azerbaijan of Boris Yeltsin, and not even the Azerbaijan of 2007-2008, when Vladimir Putin challenged the West. Today's Azerbaijan stands on the border with Armenia, has the Shusha Declaration with NATO's second-largest army, and is in close proximity to nuclear-armed Pakistan and the most technologically advanced military power, Israel. And we have 10 million people who united after the Second Karabakh War. And then suddenly, this tragedy with the plane happens. The whole world sees that it was a Russian Pantsir missile near Grozny. We understand it, because we also experienced something similar when we accidentally shot down a Russian helicopter during the Second Karabakh War. The next day, the president of Azerbaijan called, apologized, and paid compensation. There was no need to wait a whole month. And during the counter-terrorism operation, Russian peacekeepers were warned in advance not to interfere, to stay put because the operation was beginning. But they ignored it, moved around, and ended up caught in the crossfire. Again, Azerbaijan immediately apologized and paid compensation. situation. But how are they behaving now? First, they claimed it was birds, then an oxygen tank explosion, and then the president of Azerbaijan stated that an apology alone was not enough. This was not the kind of apology the Azerbaijani public expected. He said this at the funeral of the heroic pilots, in the presence of their families and the entire Azerbaijani people. At that moment, he knew that 10 million Azerbaijanis stood behind him. Who today would dare challenge Azerbaijan? Biden? Trump? Macron? Putin? None of them can, because of this national unity. And this is exactly what you, Ukrainians, lack. Watch, learn, and take note. I publicly stated it before, and I will repeat it today. Russia will apologize, pay compensation, and acknowledge its guilt. It's only a matter of time. They have no other choice, because this issue affects state relations between Russia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is neither a nuclear power nor a UN Security Council member, yet it has effectively declared a Cold War. Russia summoned the Azerbaijani ambassador. Azerbaijan immediately summoned the Russian ambassador. By the way, I met this Russian ambassador during my last visit to Baku. I know he is a professional diplomat and understands the situation in Azerbaijan very well. I hope he will reach the Kremlin and explain that anti-Russian sentiment in Azerbaijan is at an all-time high. Previously, everything seemed fine for Russia. They could visit Baku on official trips despite the blockade they are under. They need a loyal Azerbaijan, a loyal Turkey. I hope they understand this and listen to their diplomats in Baku, how mistaken they are in pressuring Azerbaijan. They will not be able to save face or manipulate events as they have done before. We have a saying in Azerbaijan, turning back from the wrong path halfway is also a God-pleasing deed. If they understand this, they will benefit. In any scenario, Azerbaijan will get what it demands. Apologies for the long response, but this is an important topic. Ukrainians, pay close attention. Never trust those who bring you gifts like the Greeks in Troy. Do not listen to biased experts who present wishful thinking as reality. Always act in the interests of your own country. Look at geography and understand. Geography decides everything. If a country is far away, like on the Galapagos Islands, and has no strategic interest in defending Ukraine, it will never defend you. Just as it will not defend Armenia. Simply look at the map and see who Armenia borders. Armenia made a mistake by surrendering its sovereignty to Russia after the Soviet collapse in exchange for the occupation of Karabach and 7 surrounding districts. And when they lost it all after the Second Karabakh War, they realized Russia would not protect them. Now, they are trying to hand over their sovereignty to France and become a vassal state. But why not become a true independent state? Why not defend your sovereignty and first establish good relations with your neighbors? Look at the map. France and the US are nowhere near. How will France intervene? The road to Europe, NATO, and Azerbaijan runs through Turkey. Or do you expect it to go through Georgia by air? That is why they destabilize Georgia, to install foreign-controlled elements. And what happens next? Then you have Iran as an enemy. Do you see the absurdity of this? As Otto von Bismarck once said, stupidity is a gift from God, but one must not misuse it. I hope our neighbors hear this message. Thank you for this opportunity.
The time you give us in the very interesting and professional broadcast are constant. Take care of yourself, please, dear Mr. Yunus, and see you soon. Thank you. Good night. Glory to Ukraine.
Подпишитесь на наш канал budrooo.news и будьте в курсе всех событий.